Ozzy Osbourne's final conversation with Marilyn Manson. It brings tears to your eyes. The phone rang at 3:47 a.m. in Los Angeles, piercing through the silence of Marilyn Manson's Beverly Hills home like a siren in the night. Few people had this private number, and even fewer would dare to call at such an ungodly hour. But when he saw Ozzy flashing on the caller ID, Brian Warner, the man behind the Marilyn Manson persona, didn't hesitate to answer, his heart immediately racing with concern. Ozzy? Manson's voice was thick with sleep and immediate worry. He had been following the news about his friend's declining health with growing anxiety. The Parkinson's disease that had been ruthlessly robbing the Prince of Darkness of his mobility, the heart problems that had forced him to cancel so many shows, and the general sense that time was running out for one of rock's most legendary figures. "Hello, mate," came the familiar Birmingham accent. But it was different now, weaker, more fragile than the booming voice that had launched 1,000 metal bands and terrified conservative parents across the globe. "Did I wake you up? I know it's bloody early over there, but I couldn't sleep and I needed to talk to someone who understands, someone who knows what it's like to be the monster everyone needs to blame." Manson sat up in bed, instantly alert despite the early hour. In nearly 3 decades of friendship, spanning from their first meeting during the 1997 Guitar World interview to their shared tours and quiet moments of artistic collaboration, Ozzy had never called him sounding like this, vulnerable, almost defeated, stripped of the larger-than-life persona that had defined him for over 50 years. This was the man who had bitten the head off a bat, who had survived decades of abuse that would have killed most people 10 times over, who had always seemed immortal, indestructible, eternal. If this deeply personal story of friendship and final goodbyes moves you, please consider leaving a like to honor both of these legendary artists and their enduring bond. "Of course not, Ozzy. You can call me any time. You know that," Manson replied, his voice full of concern as he walked to his studio where portraits of his musical heroes lined the walls, including several original paintings he had created of Ozzy himself over the years, capturing different phases of the legend's career from the early Black Sabbath days to his reality TV renaissance. "What's going on? How are you feeling? Is Sharon okay? The kids?" There was a long pause, punctuated only by the sound of Ozzy's labored breathing and what sounded like the distant hum of medical equipment. When he finally spoke, his words carried the weight of someone who knew his time was running desperately short. Someone who had been forced to confront his own mortality in a way that even decades of dangerous living hadn't prepared him for. "I'm scared, Brian," Ozzy admitted, using Manson's real name as he always did in their most personal moments, their most honest conversations about life, death, and the strange burden of being misunderstood icons, not of dying. "Christ, I've been ready for that for years. I should have died a dozen times over by now. I'm scared that people will forget what the music was really about, that they'll remember the madness, the controversy, the headlines, but forget the message underneath it all." Manson felt his throat tighten, a familiar sensation he'd experienced only a handful of times in his adult life. These two men had been bound together by more than just their shared reputation as rock's greatest outcasts, more than their mutual love of theatrical shock and artistic provocation. They had both been vilified by the media, blamed for society's ills, and forced to defend their art against accusations of corrupting the youth, promoting violence, and generally being responsible for everything wrong with modern culture. But more than that, they had found in each other a rare understanding of what it meant to live as an artist completely, without compromise or apology, in a world that demanded conformity above all else. "The music was always about giving voice to the voiceless," Manson said quietly, settling into his favorite chair in the studio. "About telling the freaks and outcasts that they weren't alone, that their darkness was valid, that being different wasn't a disease to be cured." "Exactly," Ozzy said, and Manson could hear a smile in his voice despite the obvious pain. "Tell me about the first time you heard my music. I want to hear it again. One more time. I need to know that it mattered, that it reached the people who needed it most." Manson smiled despite the tears forming in his eyes. They had talked about this before, how he had gotten Ozzy's solo debut Blizzard of Oz when he was in Christian school, how his mother had taken him to get it at the record store when it was highly frowned upon and forbidden by the school administration. But he understood why Ozzy wanted to hear it now. in what they both sensed might be their final conversation. In our final days, we all want to know that our lives had meaning, that we touched other souls, that our time on earth wasn't wasted. I was 15, Manson began, settling deeper into his chair and letting his mind travel back to those formative years. I was this weird kid in Christian school, feeling like an alien in my own skin, like I'd been dropped onto the wrong planet. My classmates thought I was a freak. The teachers thought I was a problem child destined for hell. And I was starting to think maybe they were all right. Maybe there was something fundamentally wrong with me. He paused, remembering the isolation, the confusion, the desperate search for something that would make sense of his inner turmoil. Then I heard Crazy Train for the first time, and it was like someone was speaking directly to my soul in a language I'd been waiting my whole life to hear. It wasn't just the music, though that riff was incredible. It was the attitude, the defiance, the refusal to apologize for being different. Ozzy chuckled softly on the other end of the line, a sound that managed to be both weak and wonderfully familiar. That song was about going mental, you know, about feeling like the world had gone completely mad and wondering if you were the only sane one left, or if sanity itself was just another lie they sold you. Exactly, Manson replied, his voice growing more animated as he remembered the impact of that first listening experience. But it wasn't just the lyrics. It was the way you sang them. Like you weren't ashamed of being different. Like being crazy was better than being fake. Like embracing your darkness was the only honest way to live. You had this strange mystique that you never really escaped from, despite the fact that you even had a reality TV show later. Somehow, your music transcended everything else. The controversy, the media circus, even your own public persona. You remember that poster you had? Ozzy asked, and Manson could hear the smile growing in his voice, could picture him lying in his bed at the Buckinghamshire estate, perhaps looking out at the grounds where he would soon be laid to rest. Shot in the dark poster on my wall in 10th grade, Manson confirmed without hesitation. I stared at that thing every night before I went to sleep. You looked so free, so unapologetically yourself, so completely unafraid of what the world thought about you. That's what I wanted more than anything, to be brave enough to be completely authentic, no matter what the consequences, no matter how much hate it brought down on me. The conversation that followed was unlike any they had shared before, even during their closest moments on tour, or their quietest talks about art and life. For over 2 hours, as the sun began to rise over Los Angeles and set over Buckinghamshire, these two icons of rebellion talked about everything and nothing. They discussed their shared experiences of being scapegoated by society, the endless cycle of being made into antichrists and then blamed for corrupting the youth, the weight of carrying other people's fears and prejudices on their shoulders. They talked about how they had bonded over painting during their tours together, finding peace and expression in visual art when the chaos of fame became overwhelming. Ozzy had always been a talented artist, something most people never knew about him, and he and Manson had spent many quiet hours together working on canvases, letting their brushes say what their words sometimes couldn't. You know what's funny, Ozzy said during a lull in their conversation. People always assumed we were these evil influences, these dark forces corrupting innocent minds, but most of the time we were just trying to help people feel less alone. We were giving them permission to be themselves, to embrace their weirdness, to find beauty in the darkness that society told them to hide. That's what art is supposed to do, Manson agreed. It's supposed to disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. We never set out to be villains. We just refused to pretend everything was fine when it clearly wasn't. They talked about their families, about the people who had stood by them through the worst times. Ozzy spoke lovingly of Sharon, of how she had saved his life more times than he could count, of how proud he was of his children despite all the chaos he had put them through. Manson talked about his own journey to find authentic connections in a world that seemed determined to isolate him. The thing is, Ozzy said, his voice growing contemplative, we were both searching for the same thing. Truth. Real, honest truth in a world full of lies and pretense. We just used different methods to find it and express it. And we paid the price for it, Manson added. But it was worth it, wasn't it? To know that we never compromised, that we never sold out our vision for acceptance or commercial success. Absolutely, Ozzy replied firmly. I'd rather be hated for who I really am than loved for who I'm pretending to be. As their conversation continued, they delved into specific memories, tours they had shared, conversations that had changed their perspectives, moments of connection that had sustained them through the darkest periods of their careers. They talked about the 1997 Guitar World interview, where they had first really connected, both recognizing in each other a kindred spirit who understood the burden of being perpetually misunderstood. That interview changed everything for me, Manson admitted. Talking to you, realizing that I wasn't alone in this strange existence we'd chosen, it gave me the strength to keep going when everyone was calling for my head. Same here, mate, Ozzy replied. You represented the next generation, proof that the message was getting through, that what we were doing mattered beyond just entertainment. They discussed the parallels in their careers. Both had been blamed for tragic events. Both had faced lawsuits from parents who claimed their music had driven children to suicide. Both had been forced to defend their art against accusations of promoting violence and death. The irony, they both recognized, was that their music had probably saved more lives than it had ever harmed, giving voice to the voiceless and hope to the hopeless. You know what I'm most proud of? Ozzy asked, as their conversation began to wind down, the exhaustion evident in his increasingly weak voice. It's not the records or the awards or any of that bollocks. It's the letters I've received over the years, thousands of them, from kids telling me that my music helped them feel less alone, that it gave them the courage to keep living when they wanted to give up, that maybe being different wasn't a curse after all, but a gift. "Oh, you saved my life," Manson said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. Not just with the music, but with the friendship, with the understanding, with the example you set when the world turned against me after Columbine. When I was being blamed for things I never did, you stood by me. You understood what it was like to be the monster everyone needed to blame for their own failures and fears. "We're the same, you and I," Ozzy replied, his voice carrying a warmth that contradicted his reputation as the Prince of Darkness. Two sides of the same coin, two voices in the same conversation that's been going on since the beginning of time. You took what I started and made it your own, pushed it further than I ever could have, brought it into a new century with new challenges. That's what art is supposed to do. Evolve, challenge, disturb the comfortable, and comfort the disturbed. Night, they talked about legacy, about what would remain when they were both gone. Ozzy expressed his hope that people would remember the music more than the controversy, the message more than the madness. He worried about being reduced to a caricature, to a collection of shocking headlines and outrageous moments. "The bat thing," Ozzy said with a laugh that turned into a cough. "People will probably remember that stupid bat longer than they remember Paranoid or Iron Man. Sometimes I wish I'd never done it, but then I think, at least it got people's attention. At least it made them listen to the music." "The bat was just theatre," Manson replied. "The music was the real message. And the music will outlive everything else. The headlines, the controversy, the fear, all of it. Music is immortal in a way that we aren't." As their conversation neared its end, Ozzy's voice grew even softer, more contemplative, as if he were speaking to himself as much as to his friend thousands of miles away. The weight of mortality seemed to settle over the conversation like a heavy blanket, bringing with it a clarity that only comes when time is running out. "Brian, I need you to promise me something," Ozzy said, his voice carrying an urgency that made Manson sit up straighter. "Anything, Ozzy. You know that. When I'm gone, and we both know it won't be long now, my heart's giving out and there's nothing the doctors can do about it. I need you to keep the flame burning. Not just for me, but for all the freaks and outcasts and misfits who need to know they're not alone, who need to hear that their darkness is valid, that their strangeness is beautiful." Manson wiped away tears he didn't realize had been falling, his vision blurring as he looked at the paintings on his studio walls. "I promise, Ozzy, the music never dies. Neither does the message. Neither does the bond we've shared." "Good," Ozzy said, and his voice carried a peace that hadn't been there at the beginning of the call, as if making that connection, securing that promise, had lifted a weight from his shoulders. That's all that matters, really. Everything else is just noise, just distraction. The music and the message, that's what's real. That's what lasts. They talked for a few more minutes about practical things, family members to check on, projects that would never be completed, plans that would have to be abandoned. But the real conversation was over. They both knew this was goodbye, though neither said the word explicitly. Some things are too final to speak aloud, too permanent to acknowledge directly. Take care of yourself, Brian, Ozzy said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. And thank you for everything. For being my friend when friendship was hard to find, when the whole world seemed determined to paint us as monsters, for understanding the madness, for sharing the burden, for carrying it forward when I can't anymore. Thank you, Ozzy, Manson replied, his voice thick with emotion and the weight of impending loss, for showing me it was okay to be different, for proving that authenticity matters more than acceptance, for the music, for the brotherhood, for the courage to be yourself in a world that punishes honesty, for everything you've given to all of us who never quite fit in. Right then, Ozzy said, and Manson could hear him smiling one last time, could picture that familiar grin that had launched 1,000 rebellions. Let's go crazy one more time. The music never dies, mate. Remember that. The music never dies. The line went quiet, and Manson sat in his studio for a long time afterward, surrounded by the paintings and memories of a friendship that had transcended scandal and time, controversy and misunderstanding. He knew he had just participated in something sacred, a final communion between two artists who had dared to be themselves in a world that punished authenticity, two souls who had found in each other a rare understanding of the price and privilege of living without compromise. 18 days later, on July 22, 2025, when the news broke that Ozzy Osbourne had died from a heart attack at his home in Buckinghamshire at the age of 76, Manson wasn't surprised. He had heard it in his friend's voice that night. The resignation, the peace, the readiness to go. The heart that had survived decades of abuse, addiction, and countless near-death experiences had finally given all it could give, succumbing to the coronary artery disease that had been slowly claiming him for years, complicated by the Parkinson's that had already stolen so much of his physical independence. What did surprise him was how accurately Ozzy had predicted the response to his death. When Manson attended the private funeral at the Osbourne family estate in Buckinghamshire on July 30th, 8 days after Ozzy's passing, he wrote on social media, "Today we laid to rest a beloved friend. I'm eternally grateful that you let me into your life, Ozzy. Your inspiration and love will always be with me." The backlash had been swift and predictable, a reminder of how little the world had learned about judging others. When Manson's video tribute played at Ozzy's final concert weeks earlier, the Back to the Beginning show that had become Ozzy's farewell to the stage, it was met with boos from some in the crowd. Social media exploded with anger and criticism, people unable to separate the art from the artist, the friendship from the controversy. But Manson remembered Ozzy's words from that final conversation. Everything else is just noise. The music mattered, the friendship mattered, the message mattered. Standing at the graveside, watching as one of rock's greatest rebels was laid to rest beside the lake on his estate, Manson felt the weight of the promise he had made. Around him stood other mourners, Sharon with her quiet dignity, the children who had grown up in the shadow of their father's legend, musicians who had been inspired by Ozzy's fearless authenticity. The ceremony was beautiful and reverent, exactly what Ozzy would have wanted. No pretense, no manufactured drama, just genuine love and respect for a man who had lived his truth regardless of the consequences. In the weeks that followed, as the music world mourned the loss of its most iconic rebel, the man who had died peacefully at home surrounded by family, his final battle with coronary artery disease and Parkinson's finally over, Manson found himself returning to that final conversation again and again. Ozzy had been right about so many things, about the nature of fame, about the importance of authenticity, about the eternal power of music to connect souls across all boundaries of time, space, and social convention. But most of all, he had been right about the promise. The music would never die. In every young artist who dared to be different, in every misfit who found solace in a heavy riff or a rebellious lyric, in every person who chose authenticity over acceptance, the spirit of Ozzy Osbourne would live on. The flame that had been passed from Black Sabbath to a generation of metal bands, from Ozzy's solo career to artists like Marilyn Manson, would continue to burn, lighting the way for future generations of beautiful, strange, and perfectly imperfect souls. In the months following Ozzy's death, as tributes poured in from around the world and his influence on multiple generations became even clearer, Manson found new meaning in their friendship. It hadn't just been about shared experiences of controversy and misunderstanding. It had been about artistic integrity, about the courage to remain true to your vision even when the whole world seemed arrayed against you. The last thing Ozzy had said to him that night, almost as an afterthought but perhaps the most important words of their entire conversation, had been the most prophetic. Remember, Brian, they can kill the dreamer, but they can never kill the dream. Those words would echo in Manson's mind forever, a final gift from a friend who had taught him that being different wasn't just acceptable, it was essential. In a world desperate for conformity, they had both chosen chaos. In a society that demanded silence, they had chosen to scream. In a culture that feared authenticity, they had chosen to be devastatingly, beautifully, unapologetically real. And the music, beautiful, disturbing, life-affirming, soul-stirring music, would indeed never die. It would continue to speak to the outcasts and misfits, to the ones who felt too weird for this world, to anyone who had ever looked in the mirror and wondered if there was something fundamentally wrong with being themselves. Through every guitar riff, every rebellious lyric, every moment of artistic courage, the conversation that Ozzy had started would continue. In Marilyn Manson, in the friendship they had shared, and the conversations they had cherished, in the promise that had been made and would be kept, a part of the Prince of Darkness would continue to inspire new generations of dreamers, rebels, and beautiful freaks to embrace their darkness and let their light shine through. The flame would never be extinguished, the music would never stop, and the message would live on. It's not just okay to be different, it's the only way to be truly alive. If this tribute to the enduring friendship between these two controversial but influential artists touched your heart, please consider sharing your appreciation with a like. Their legacy of authenticity and artistic courage continues to inspire those brave enough to be themselves in a world that often punishes honesty.